Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Marijeta Bozovic, an assistant professor of Slavic languages and literatures at Yale. She is focused on 20th and 21st century Russian poetry, Russian and Balkan avant-gardes, diasporas, and transnational culture, translation, and adaptation across media, and the poetics and politics of the Danube River. She is the author of several publications, including Nabokov's Canon, From Onegin to Ada, which is due out in 2016. Today, we talk with her about her newest book project titled Avant-Garde, Post-Radical Poetics After the Soviet Union. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's begin with an overview of your book. Tell us about it.
Okay, so my new book project focuses on a constellation, or an archipelago, if you will, of contemporary Russian poets. They're mostly based in St. Petersburg and Moscow, and they center around a number of journals, event series, programming series, small publications. They work together, and they have a similar interest in that they are politically engaged poets. Which is absolutely fascinating to me, because of course the context for politically engaged poetry is very different in today's Russia. It's one thing to be an explicitly leftist poet, which these poets that I study are, in, let's say, an academic American setting or working and writing in France, than it is to be openly leftist in the year 2000, a mere decade after the fall of the Soviet Union. So these are poets who are risking something, and their poetics engage radical politics or progressive politics and experiments with form. Mm-hmm. This is what interests me tremendously. And my new book project is an attempt to examine this new cultural formation, this loose group or movement, even if you will, mini movement, in the context of the avant-garde, thinking of it as a new pulse of the avant-garde, perhaps a continuation of a paradoxical avant-garde tradition.
Okay. And what led you to start the book?
Well, actually, I had meant to work on contemporary post-Soviet poetry from many years ago. In 2002, I had a Fulbright to Russia. I spent a year in Moscow and was focusing on contemporary, at the time, conceptualist, post-conceptualist poetry. Mm-hmm. I came back from that research year and wrote a master's thesis on conceptualist Russian poetry, but I let it go. I felt somehow I hadn't found my real protagonists yet, mm-hmm. and I changed directions with my research. My dissertation and the first book, which you mentioned, mm-hmm. ended up being on Nabokov, on émigré and transnational literatures, which was something that I felt I could do well then and in the context of living and writing in New York City, mm-hmm. which I was. So it was a while before I returned to contemporary poetry as my project. When I finished the first book, mostly, I decided to return to Russia, and I've been going back 1 or 2 times a year for summers mostly. And it began in 2012. I came to do research on contemporary poetry, and I walked straight into some of the most exciting protests that I'd ever encountered. This had started in 2011 and was part of now it's known as the long year 2012. Immense political protests all over the country, many in Moscow and mm-hmm. Petersburg. And I somehow entered into this, met many people through these protests, and I asked around, who were the poets who were somehow central? Who were the poets who were speaking the language? Who were the poets involved with protest culture most actively? Mm-hmm. I kept hearing the same names over and over again, names like Kirill Medvedev, for example, or Pavel Arsenyev, the journal, Petersburg journal, Translit. And I thought, okay, I think I found my protagonist, mm-hmm. and now I can return to this project.
Okay, so because it's such a present concept, how did you do the research for it?
My research methods had to change completely. Mm-hmm. This was the first time that I was working so actively on living writers. Mm-hmm. So it's a lot more risky, a lot less safe than working on Nabokov in some sense.
Did you get to speak to them directly?
Absolutely. So I know and work with all of these poets.
Oh, wow.
Which means that my methods are completely different. Mm-hmm. It's not archival research, poking through letters, but it involves interviews for the first time mm-hmm. for me. So I had to completely retrain to mm-hmm. figure out how to be able to do that.
And how was that process for you?
Terrifying, honestly, but it felt challenging but extremely important. Terrifying, well, because of course there are simply the emotional risks. You can publish an interpretation of a poet who can then completely disagree with you, or worse yet, think that you're a fool.
Right.
So there's that risk. But also for me, I'm very sensitive about not wanting to engage in something that seems like intellectual or academic colonialism. I don't want to think about writing on somehow static subjects, but instead I really try to think about it as a collaboration with these poets and writers. And interviews really help with that. But also ways of gathering material are completely different. In some cases, the material is gathered online because many of these poets use LiveJournal and Facebook and Twitter and other forms of disseminating, non-traditional forms of disseminating their work.
Right.
But in other cases, it involves being there, being at the performances where they read their poems, being in protest contexts to see how, let's say, the reading or performance of a poem galvanizes a crowd, how it works in context.
Interesting. So tell us a little bit about each of the poets that you include in the project.
Okay, I'll start.
And why?
I've narrowed it down. It has been extraordinarily difficult to narrow it down, but to 6 poets, and there's a chapter each, the way that the book is currently working.
Okay.
2 of the poets have actually been to Yale. One, Kirill Medvedev, who has had an anthology of his work published in English with N+1 and Ugly Duckling Press. It's called It's No Good, and it's fantastic. That anthology has also received a great deal of acclaim, and Kirill Medvedev is getting really international attention now. He's publishing also essays, political essays and cultural essays in places like the New Left Review. And he came to Yale 2 years ago to give a reading. And I think that might have been the first introduction to some of the students and graduate students here to this wonderful figure. And he's young and dynamic and also sings and performs his poems in a way that you absolutely cannot be left indifferent when listening. So that, I think, was the first introduction not only to him and his poetics, but also to the fact that something extremely exciting and new was happening in the poetry world in Russia. Another poet who came here last fall was Dmitry Galinka. He's also an academic, a theorist. And last fall, he was based in Iowa in the prestigious Iowa Writers' Workshop. But we managed to steal him for a day and a half. And he came and gave a reading. And again, we had his works in the original and translation. Students were able to meet him and ask him about how he lives and works, and also questions like, does he want to stay in Russia? How does he conceive of that? So these are 2 that have already been here. And actually, this spring, I'm bringing 3 more in the context of a conference that I'll mention a little bit later. One of them is a Georgian-born poet, female poet, Keti Chukhrov, who writes these absolutely fabulous poetic dramas that draw attention to and imagine the voices of the unheard and unseen of Moscow. So the immigrant workers, the people who work at the cheap marketplaces and rynaks, and her work is absolutely marvelous. She's also an academic, a theorist, works on Anglo-American poetry, which is and literature, which is very interesting. Alexander Skidan is also coming. He is a St. Petersburg institution in his own right, was associated with language school, poetry, and somehow is always a figure around whom a constellation of other poets revolves. And then finally, a younger poet, Pavel Arseniev, who is one of the founders of the journal Transnational, and who is an absolutely marvelous young impresario, full of energy, and again, who's, I think, done more to create and push this movement in Petersburg than almost anyone else.
So let me ask you, especially for the poets that are living in Russia now, are they fearful of any repercussions of their writings?
Abstractly speaking, yes, but this is not something that comes up in conversation. Not for their poetry. So, for example, Pavel Arseniev, he goes by Pasha, was arrested during a reading of his poetry. It was for using obscenity in a poem, and he was let go immediately. Now, of course, the context could change, but this has been, it is not quite the way that it is portrayed in the media.
Okay.
However, some of these poets are political activists who are at the forefront of various various protests, various meetings. And I think the more actively politically engaged you are, the more you could be potentially at risk.
So what are the subjects that these poets are dealing with in terms of the protest? What are they protesting? Does it vary from poet to poet?
It does. Also, the style, the manner in which they express themselves. Part of the reason that I'm looking at 6 poets who are so different from one another is because I'm interested in this range. Kirill writes more, I want to say, deceptively straightforward poetry, where he might talk about a march in the mayor's office, for example, or protesters standing and then being attacked for trying to protest a forest being brought down. So that there's a really kind of active, openly political aspect to his subjects. He's very inspired by the work of Charles Bukowski, and actually was a translator of Bukowski's work into Russian. So he perhaps is on one extreme. Katie Chukhrov, who I mentioned, writing these they're very beautiful, very moving poetic dramas, calling attention to, in a very artistic way, to the plight of guest workers, would be another very different example. And then someone like Alexander Sasha Skidan writes language poetry that's extraordinarily difficult and meticulous. I mean, just very difficult even on the language of, on the level of language itself, but also on the philosophical material that it draws from. So there, the connection to poetry is most abstract and has to do perhaps with the way that language poetry can expose discourse and the violence, the everyday violence we commit, and the language that we use, the phrases that we repeat.
How popular do you think the poetry is in Russia? Are they widely read?
No, this is an avant-garde. And avant-gardes are always speaking to a more limited audience. That said, I think several of the poets, Kirill, whom I've mentioned several times, also another poet, Roman Sminkin, are interested in reaching wider audiences through recourse to music. So they both also participate in bands. Protest rock in the case of Kirill Medvedev. Roman Sminkin has a techno poetry project. And I think these are ways of trying to reach and in part create a wider audience. Again, of course, this is not a massive movement, but it's a movement, or it's a pocket worth examining nonetheless.
So, and why is it important to examine this pocket of poets and in terms of the movement and you know, what they're contributing to history, basically?
I think it's more important than ever in today's political climate, especially. For me, what the stakes are disturbing a media portrayal of Russia as somehow culturally monolithic or static or predictable. It's extraordinarily important to me to bring attention to the attention of students, the attention of readers, the attention of other academics, the attention of American poets, to the fact that there are minoritarian groups who completely disagree with everything that is being shown in mainstream culture and who are holding their own. These poets and their artist and activist friends are collaborating with, communicating with, and standing with their counterparts in Ukraine, in Poland, and have a great deal more in common with American language poets and activists than people might think.
Do these poets correspond with each other or meet with each other? Is there any, do they have any kind of relationship or?
Very much so.
Yes,
and this is one of the ways that I've delimited my project, why I'm trying to think of it again as a loose constellation. These poets all publish in the journal Transnational, which has been the absolute heart of my project. But then they've also collaborated with each other in readings, sometimes staging dramas, and in a chapbook series, the Craft series, and then with translations and original texts in the Free Marxist Press. They're constantly coming up with new projects and working together. So in some cases, you can even think of them, well, as a close-knit network, group of friends, even a kind of family of sorts. And this gives it an identity.
Right, okay, very good. So when can we expect the book?
I'm hoping to finish it next year. Next year is a leave year for me.
Okay.
And I'm hoping that shortly after that, it will be complete. Okay. One event that will be associated with the project, as I mentioned, that some of these poets are coming here. They're coming for a conference at Yale in April called Political Violence and Militant Aesthetics After Socialism. And that's actually happening in the Whitney Humanities Center and is partly sponsored, made possible by the Macmillan Center.
Wonderful.
So there will be poetry readings, an event at Art Space downtown New Haven with local artists participating as well as the Yale community.
Very exciting. We'll have to look for that then. Okay, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay. For more information about Professor Bozovic and her research, please visit our website at yale.edu/Macmillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through the funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.